If you've made it this far, thank you. This is the last portion of my debate with Cameron Bertuzzi on whether horrendous suffering disproves God, where I'll be giving my closing statement. So let's dive right in. Let me start with a reminder. We're not talking about whether suffering is compatible with theism, but whether horrific suffering is. The kind of soul-destroying suffering involved when a mother discovers her child's decapitated head after a car accident, and holds onto it mourning for nearly an hour before handing it over to first responders. If you find it plausible that this sort of thing is necessarily incompatible with theism, their possibilities aren't enough to undermine that confidence, as I've already explained. But maybe I have to do more work than showing that the premises in the argument are more plausible than not. If I do, Cameron hasn't actually made a case for it, but merely referenced a paper. That's not going to be enough in a context where he's constantly trying to saddle me with as much burden as he possibly can. Let's now turn to the premises one last time. For Schellenberg, God would be our ultimate end and deepest good simply in virtue of what he is and what the term God means. I think very many theists implicitly accept this, so I'm going to move on to other premises for the sake of time. God's depth, goodness, and beauty would be inexhaustible. When you combine this fact with our limited capacities, which God himself designed, you have powerful reason to think premise 2 is true. Astonishingly, one of Cameron's main responses is to accuse me of committing logical fallacies. However, when offering reasons to think a premise is true, they don't have to prove its truth logically and inescapably. Rather, the reasons simply need to count in the premise's favor. Claiming that this is a non sequitur is an elementary mistake. But surely we can imagine a bizarre scenario where premise 2 is false. So what? I've given reasons to think premise 2 is more plausible than not, so pushing back with mere possibilities is an underwhelming response that completely fails to engage with the reasons we have for thinking it's true. Cameron continues to spout possibilities without really defending any of them by bringing up the fact that a Christian philosopher wrote a thing that disagrees with me. What exactly am I supposed to do with that if he doesn't actually unpack the reasoning to argue against the premise? Additionally, I suggest that empirical claims won't be very helpful here. Part of my reason for thinking that is due to the kind of data we have. Some people claim that horrors brought them closer to God, and others are completely destroyed by them. This spread is easily explained on more than one hypothesis, and so shouldn't be our focus. Because of who God would be, I've argued that he wouldn't allow horrors to befall us unless they were necessary for our deepest good. Perfect empathy would be inconsistent with doing so, and there are no outweighing goods distinct from our deepest good that could provide an exception, since God embodies the greatest goods prior to creation, without evil. Thus, I argue that any world modeling those goods, whether it be only God or some variation of God with creatures and no evil, would be at least as good, if not better, than any world with evil. Divine empathy breaks any ties. Cameron apparently rejects that the greatest goods are contained in God and reaps a flurry of consequences. First, this is a rejection of traditional theism. Second, it seems to make creation necessary. There may be no best possible world on theism, but it doesn't follow that there aren't best possible worlds. Plausibly, the set of best possible worlds will be those where all the greatest types of goods are realized, and God would be free to actualize whichever one he wanted. If God is maximally disposed towards actualizing intrinsically good states of affairs, and a state of affairs where certain virtues obtain is not just better, but obviously better than one where they don't, i.e. it's a best possible world, then God will actualize that state of affairs. To claim that a perfect being wouldn't choose an obviously more intrinsically valuable state of affairs over another as just described is implausible in the extreme. Further, Cameron's position entails that God is lacking in a fundamental way. For if exemplifying virtue is always better than only being disposed towards it, then God not only needs a creation, but he needs a creation with evil in order to become his best possible self. And while it's true that lacking something doesn't always imply a defect, in this case, at a minimum, I'd call it a troubling incompleteness. For Cameron, the token forgiveness is better than whatever type of pure goodness existed in God prior to creation related to it. This seems to suggest that God can improve or grow in various changing circumstances. One clarification that he was able to help make was that I actually worded something carelessly. My appeal to the moral principle was not a defense of premise 4, but rather a response to Cameron's objection to it. His objections require that he deny a moral principle that prominent Christian philosophers accept. And what's the moral principle he offers in its place? That God can sacrifice us like pawns in a cosmic chess game for the sake of abstract ontological goods? Cameron has gone to some strange places to try and get out of this argument. He rejects that an ever-deepening relationship with God is our deepest good. He thinks a world with horrific suffering might be necessary to grow closer to the infinite fountain of goodness. Who just so happened to design our nature and capacities to experience them in the first place. He rejects traditional notions of theism in favor of views that plausibly necessitate a creation, and imply a troubling incompleteness in God. He rejects plausible moral principles that prominent Christian philosophers accept. All of this to say, the bravado on his part is spectacularly excessive. If you're watching this after he's released it, then tap this video next to me for Cameron's closing statement.